When male soldiers were captured during the Second World War, they became prisoners of war. They were searched, registered, placed in camps. There were rules, conventions, at least on paper. When women were captured, those rules often disappeared. They wore uniforms, they carried weapons, they served on the front lines. And yet, when they fell into German hands, many were treated as if they did not belong to the war at all. By 1941, the Soviet Union had mobilized hundreds of thousands of women. They served as medics, snipers, machine gunners, pilots, radio operators. Some fought within regular units, others served in partisan formations behind German lines. They were soldiers. This was not symbolic service. Female soldiers killed enemy troops, they coordinated artillery fire, they carried the wounded off the battlefield, and they were captured. Capture was chaos. Front lines shifted quickly, units were encircled, wounded soldiers were left behind. For women, capture carried an additional burden, not just fear of imprisonment, but uncertainty about whether they would be recognized as prisoners at all. In theory, the Geneva Convention applied to all uniformed combatants. In practice, German forces often ignored it when the prisoner was female. Nazi ideology left little room for women as soldiers. The regime defined women primarily as mothers, caretakers, bearers of the nation. A woman who carried a rifle did not fit that worldview. A female enemy combatant was seen not just as an opponent, but as a violation of natural order. This perception mattered because ideology shaped policy, and policy shaped behavior in the field. Male prisoners were cataloged. They were assigned numbers. Uniforms were confiscated. They entered a system. Women often did not. Captured female soldiers were frequently removed from POW columns. They were interrogated separately, labeled as partisans or spies, labels that carried different consequences. Partisans were not treated as prisoners of war. They were treated as criminals. Once classified as partisans, captured women fell outside conventional protections. They could be detained indefinitely, transferred to Gestapo custody, or executed without trial. This was not always written policy. Often it was discretionary, decisions made by officers in the field, decisions shaped by ideology, fear, and dehumanization. For many women, capture meant disappearance. No Red Cross notification, no prisoner lists, no official status. Families were left with nothing, not even confirmation of death. This silence would continue long after the war ended, because these stories were rarely documented in real time, and when they were often buried. What happened after capture varied. Some women were sent to camps, some were interrogated for weeks, some were killed almost immediately. To understand why, we have to look at how the system worked and where it broke down. The Eastern Front was different from every other battlefield of the war. It was not only a military campaign, it was an ideological war. From the beginning, German leadership framed it as a fight against an enemy that did not deserve protection. Orders emphasized ruthlessness. Political officers were to be executed. Partisans were to be eliminated. Civilians suspected of resistance were to be punished. Into this environment stepped women in uniform. On the Eastern Front, women were not a rarity. They fought openly. Snipers, machine gunners, medics pulling wounded men from under fire. By 1943, German units routinely encountered armed women. This challenged German assumptions. A woman with a rifle disrupted expectations, and disruption bred suspicion. Captured women were often not processed as regular POWs. Instead, they were labeled partisan, bandit, saboteur. These labels did not require proof, they required belief. Partisan warfare was widespread behind German lines, and women played key roles in it. They carried messages, transported weapons, gathered intelligence. Some fought directly. To German forces, this blurred every line. A woman could be a nurse by day and a partisan by night. That belief shaped how captives were treated. Men captured in battle were usually sent to POW camps. Women often were not. They were held in improvised facilities, transferred between units, or handed over to the Gestapo. Once under Gestapo authority, the rules of war no longer applied. Interrogation replaced registration. Punishment replaced custody. German intelligence believed female prisoners possessed valuable information about partisan networks, about local populations, about supply routes. Interrogation was systematic. The goal was not legal processing. The goal was extraction, information at any cost. Some women were interrogated repeatedly over weeks. Others disappeared after a single session. Records were inconsistent, often deliberately incomplete. German doctrine viewed partisans as the most dangerous enemy, invisible, unpredictable, embedded in civilian life. Women fit this profile in the eyes of occupation forces. They were less likely to be suspected, more likely to move unnoticed, and therefore, in German thinking, more threatening. As a result, many captured women were never recorded as prisoners of war. Some were sent to concentration camps without POW designation. Others were executed near the point of capture. Exact numbers are unknown, not because they were small, but because the system was designed to leave no trace. After the war, investigators struggled to reconstruct what had happened. German records were incomplete. Soviet records were often sealed. Many women never returned to testify. What survived were fragments, letters, witness statements, scattered reports from liberated camps. These were not isolated incidents. They were the result of a system where ideology overruled law. To understand the full picture, we must look at how policy became practice and how abuse became routine. German leadership did not issue a single explicit order that defined how captured female soldiers must be treated. Instead, it created something more dangerous: ambiguity. Orders spoke of bandits, of illegal combatants, of enemies outside the law. They did not specify gender. They did not need to. On the Eastern Front, authority was fragmented. The Wehrmacht conducted conventional military operations. The SS handled ideological enforcement. The police units managed occupation and security. Each interpreted orders differently. Some Wehrmacht units processed captured women as prisoners of war. They followed procedure. They sent them to camps. But this was inconsistent, and inconsistency was the problem. SS and police units operated under different assumptions. They did not view the Eastern Front as a conventional battlefield. They viewed it as territory to be pacified. In that framework, a woman with a weapon was not a soldier. She was proof of disorder, and disorder demanded correction. Classification determined fate. A woman labeled POW entered a system with at least minimal oversight. A woman labeled partisan did not. Once classified as a partisan, custody transferred to security forces. There were no inspections, no Red Cross visits, only interrogation. What began as exception became routine. Officers learned that mistreatment was rarely punished. Subordinates learned what was expected without being told. Abuse did not require orders, it required silence. This does not mean every unit behaved identically. Some officers attempted to follow law, others ignored it entirely. But for captured women, the outcome was often the same. They existed in a gray zone, recognized as enemies, denied the rights of soldiers. Documentation was deliberately limited.
Transfers were unrecorded, executions were summarized, names were omitted. This was not negligence, it was design, a system built to operate without accountability. Partisan warfare instilled fear. Units were attacked unexpectedly, supply lines were sabotaged, suspicion became constant. In that environment, dehumanization accelerated. Captured women were no longer individuals, they were symbols, and symbols are easier to destroy. Behind these structures were real people, women whose experiences varied but followed recognizable patterns. To understand what this meant in human terms, we need to look at individual cases.
The experiences of captured female soldiers varied, but across different regions, units, and years, patterns emerged. These are not isolated anecdotes, they are recurring outcomes. Female snipers occupied a particular place in German perception. They were feared, respected, and deeply resented. German reports frequently described them as unusually dangerous adversaries. When female snipers were captured, they were often not treated as prisoners of war. They were interrogated immediately, accused of operating independently, accused of partisan activity, even when captured in uniform. Survivor testimony indicates that some were executed shortly after capture. Others disappeared into detention systems from which no records remain. Medics should have been protected under international law. They were non-combatants, marked by insignia, in theory. In practice, female medics were frequently accused of aiding partisan activity, of carrying messages, of hiding weapons. Their proximity to the wounded made them suspect. Their mobility made them threatening. Many were removed from POW streams and transferred for interrogation. Partisan units operated behind German lines. Women were integral to these networks. They served as couriers, saboteurs, scouts, sometimes fighters. Captured partisans were not considered soldiers, they were considered criminals. For women, this classification often carried immediate consequences. Executions were common. Detention was indefinite. Legal process was absent. Some captured women were transported to concentration camps, not as prisoners of war, but as political prisoners. Their status was ambiguous. They were subject to camp discipline without military oversight, and they were rarely recorded as former soldiers. A small number survived. Their testimonies form the backbone of what we know today. They describe confusion at capture, shock at being separated from male prisoners, and the realization that the rules no longer applied. Across these cases, one pattern is clear. Gender became a liability. Uniforms did not guarantee protection. Service did not guarantee recognition. Captured female soldiers existed in a space the law did not reach. When the war ended, the suffering did not immediately become history. For many women, the aftermath would bring a different kind of silence. When the war in Europe ended in 1945, survival did not automatically bring recognition. For many captured female soldiers, it brought silence. Some returned home after months or years in detention. Others were released from camps without documentation. Many came back alone. Male prisoners of war were counted. They were registered, recognized, often compensated. Women frequently were not. They did not fit existing categories, not civilians, not officially recognized POWs, in some cases, not recognized as veterans at all. Without records, there was no proof. Without proof, there was no status. Returning women were sometimes met not with gratitude, but with suspicion. Questions were asked. Why had they survived? What had happened in captivity? Silence was often safer than explanation. Many chose not to speak, not because they forgot, but because no one was ready to listen. Some testimonies surfaced only decades later, often after political change, after archives opened, after witnesses felt secure. What emerged were not stories of heroism. They were stories of uncertainty, of rules applied one day and ignored the next. Military history focused on battles. Political history focused on leaders. There was little space for those who existed between categories. Captured female soldiers did not fit the traditional narrative of war, so they were left out. In some countries, recognition came later, very late. Historians began documenting these cases. Museums collected testimonies. Archives slowly released material, but many names were already lost. This is not only a story about what happened to women, it is a story about how systems fail when people fall outside expectations. The laws of war existed, but they depended on recognition, and recognition depended on belief. These women fought, they were captured, and then, in many cases, they were erased. Not because their suffering was insignificant, but because history did not know where to place them. Today, their stories are being recovered, slowly, imperfectly, but they matter. Because war is not only fought on battlefields, it is fought in how rules are applied and in who is allowed to count. This was the hidden fate of captured female soldiers, and this is why it took history so long to speak their names.